Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This week we are going to be covering the social cognitive views of learning and motivation, which is Chapter 11 out of Woolfolk. As you may remember, I mentioned that we would be getting back to Bandura in this chapter. So Bandura, if you remember, was the gentleman who most commonly associated with the Bobo doll experiments. We spent just a tiny amount of time on that at the end of chapter 7. And so we are going to be getting back to his views, which are based primarily on this idea of observation. But he is also known for things like motivation and self-efficacy, which we will cover during this chapter. And I feel that most students find this chapter and the one that follows, chapters 11 and 12, to be particularly interesting. I would also note for you that these two chapters are going to be important for you in conducting that motivational interview, which is due towards the end of November. I believe it's right after break. If you want to check on that, using this little bit. So particularly paying attention to this chapter with the in mind, as well as for the final. That being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the objectives for this week. And those objectives are different computer than I normally would use. A little bit of trouble with it. Anyway, the objectives for this week are to be able to define modeling / observational learning, self-efficacy, and agency. So to be able to define all three, to understand the components and interactions of triarchic reciprocal causality, to discuss the roles of observation and modeling in learning, including factors that support learning by observation, to be able to distinguish between self-concept, self-esteem, and self-efficacy, to be able to describe important components of self-regulated learning, to be able to compare and contrast the Winnie and Perry model of self-regulated learning with the Zimmerman model, and then lastly, to be able to apply your knowledge to teach for self-efficacy and self-regulated learning. So applying your knowledge to teach for self-efficacy and self-regulated learning. So this idea of applying your knowledge, as you know, most of our exam questions are application-based. So there's that component to understanding this, but also for those of you going into a career in education, it's going to be particularly important. All right, so we are actually going to start with a short video. Well, not too short, about 9 minutes long. We'll save this. My preference would be that you would go ahead and watch it now with me. However, it is also available on Icon, so if you choose to skip over it for now, that's certainly okay. However, there is a little reflective exercise that I'm going to ask you to do, so again, my preference is just that you watch it with me now. So I'm going to go ahead and get this started here in YouTube.
I think it's safe to say that
Okay, so that was our video on self-efficacy. There are some important things in there in terms of the 4 factors that influence self-efficacy, so make sure you key in on those. That's why I show it, besides the fact that I also think that the people that she interviews actually have a very good take on life, and it's good modeling in general for all of us. So social cognitive theory is society or social, right? The social plus cognitive, so plus thinking. So the point here is that other people play a role in our learning by serving as models and teachers. So that's the social aspect. And also, social cognitive theory includes thinking, believing, evaluating, self-regulation, expecting, and anticipating, which is the cognitive. So social cognitive includes both the social and that cognitive aspect of it. So Bandura's social cognitive theory differs from Vygotsky in that the locus or center, so the focus of it is internal, it's cognition, whereas Vygotsky was more interested in the external, so the things outside of us that help us learn. In other words, Vygotsky was all about nurture. Bandura is less so, although it certainly plays a component. Obviously, with social cognitive theory, we can't get away from the external. What Bandura is saying, however, is that we are motivated by more than just behavior, and this is an important turning point within the field of psychology and educational psychology in particular. So remember that video about the children beating up the doll? It was that transition from Skinner's Black Box where we could just say that behavior, so the observed behavior was the learning. So it was definitely a shift in thinking, and that's what makes it so important. But there's definitely just inherently interesting to think about learning in this way. At this point, I'm going to ask you to just take a moment and do a little bit of self-reflection. So think of some things that motivate or influence what you learn, especially those things that you are good at, those mastery experiences. So remember, that comes from the definition of self-efficacy, which was those 4 factors that were covered in the video. So if you haven't watched the video yet, make sure that you do that. So think of some things that motivate or influence what you learn, especially those things that you're good at. Who shares these things with you? So a lot of times we are influenced by other people in enjoyment. So at this point in my life, I am very into my program, right? I'm getting my PhD in ed psych. And what I have found, however, is that it's still important to me to have that social persuasion. So finding other people that are interested in it and being able to share it with them is especially important, even at a high mastery experience level. So who shares these things with you? Who did or do you want to be like? So the social modeling of vicarious experiences. So at first, trying to think who would have been my first model to move towards teaching, and it was probably my 6th grade teacher, Miss Hines. That was just an incredible class, and in fact, there are a few of the young girls that were in that class with me that I'm still friends with, at least on Facebook. But this idea of the social modeling and vicarious experiences. So when we think back even to Gardner's multiple intelligences, we can kind of see where somebody's interest in something, so if our parents are interested in something, that's going to influence our own desire to know about it. So you could have 3 or 4 generations of mechanics, for example. And then what makes you feel good? So what kind of psychological response or physiological arousal do you experience? So for some of us, it may be more cognitive, that we just feel good about achievement. Some of us actually get a spark from speaking in front of people, for example. That might be another way of thinking about it. So again, kind of interrupted myself in explaining this full reflection, but just trying to help you pull it out and get more out of the reflection. So think of some things that motivate you to learn, especially those things that you're good at. Who shares these things with you? Who did or do you want to be like in pursuing these things, and what makes you feel good about doing them? So just take a minute or two, and hopefully you've been spending some time doing that while I've been talking. So the next thing that we're going to cover is this idea of the triarchic reciprocal causality. So it sounds all kinds of scary. It's this big word, and words maybe that we haven't heard together before, and so that tends to make us a little apprehensive, tends to ruin our self-efficacy. But let's break it down. So tri means 3. I bet all of you knew that, and I bet all of you could conceive of archic or in an arc being a circle. And then this idea of reciprocal is that it's shared back and forth, and causality is just cause. So basically, we have 3 things that are going around and around in a circle, influencing and causing reactions and behaviors. Pretty easy, actually. Triarchic reciprocal causality. So the next question is, what are the 3 things? So what are we dealing with here? And those 3 things are social influences, are environmental variables, and those include models, they include instruction, and they include feedback. And we also have achievement outcomes. These are our behaviors. So goal progress, motivation, and then learning itself. And then we have self-influences. These are personal variables. So our own goals, our feelings of self-efficacy, our outcome expectations, attribution. So attribution is who we ascribe the outcome to. So students sometimes will make an attribution to an instructor rather than, so if they fail a course, they assign the fault or the cause to the instructor rather than to themselves and their own behavior. So that's the idea of attribution. Who am I giving it to? Who do I believe is responsible for the outcome? Other self-influences include progress and self-evaluation, and then the self-regulatory progress. So these 3 things kind of act in tandem. Each one influences the other, and so it's really hard for us actually to pull apart behavior and learning, as we'll see in my example here, which I hope you find amusing. I certainly do. So my example is I see Kim Kardashian as my model, my teacher, my influence, wearing $300 rubber sandals. I decide that I want them. This is the achievement, the learning. But then my inner guru steps in and says, no, that's crazy. You're a grad student and you're not making any money. This is something I learned, so you need cheaper shoes. So I start looking around at what other people on campus are wearing. Maybe I ask some friends and they decide to buy Crocs or something else. So that's social influence. I go to the store, and as I'm looking at them, I think everybody has them and I want to be different. So that's my personality influence. So this is who I am. I tend to be slightly rebellious. So I want to be different. I don't like to follow along with everybody else. I like to march to my own drum. So I start looking at the labels of different rubber type sandals and evaluate them based on what I know about these types of shoes. So again, that's my achievement, my learning. The first day I wear them, someone makes a snarky comment to me about them. So I have a social influence of feedback. I decide I don't like them and I want to get some new sandals. So this is self-influence of cool. So Again, it's just the important thing here is to recognize that triarchic reciprocal causality is all three things working together. So each one influences the other, and we can never know exactly which direction the circle is going. It could be going back one way, or it could be going the other. It could be counter or clockwise. So there are some factors that influence observational learning. This is from a chart in Woolfolk that was put together by Schnook. So so I have the characteristic on one side and the effect on the other. So developmental status. So this is the idea if we think back to our developmental chapter. In chapter 2, we can maybe think of Piaget's stages. So developmental improvements such as longer attention span and increased processing capacity allow greater strategy development, concept development, and intrinsic motivation. So this influences our ability to learn from observation. So we pay more attention to what other people are doing, and we ascribe value to that based on what we've already experienced. The next characteristic is model prestige and confidence. So my example was Kim Kardashian. I wouldn't say that she's exactly a high status model, but she is in some ways. She's definitely a beautiful woman who has made a considerable amount of money. So the effect of the model prestige and confidence is the higher the status of the model, the more likely the learner is to follow their lead, and their experience provides an indication of value. So we make assumptions based on our model and what they've achieved, and that influences whether we observe them and use them as someone to learn from. Another characteristic that influences observational learning is vicarious consequences. So this is the idea that we observe our model, and what happens to them influences our desire to follow suit. So and another thing to note here is that the more we identify with the model, the greater the influence is. So if we are, if we're Hispanic and our model is Hispanic, then we may be more likely to follow in the footsteps of that model. Another characteristic is outcome expectations. So if the action that we observe is considered appropriate and attainable, we are more likely to do it. Goal setting is another characteristic, and the effect here is that behaviors that help the model obtain goals are more likely to be copied. And then lastly, we have self-efficacy, which is going to keep coming up and up and up from here on in within this course and hopefully within your life. So characteristic is self-efficacy, and our belief that we are capable of learning and performing the act influences our desire to mimic it. So if we don't believe we can do it, we're probably not going to be inclined to follow the lead of the model. So I can watch somebody do tricks in a skateboard park, but my self-efficacy on that is particularly low, and I don't have any real desire to do it. So I don't have a desire to mimic it. However, if you were pretty good on a skateboard, that might change your point of view. Or if I was pretty good at a skateboard, that might change my point of view. So let's talk a little bit about self-efficacy and agency. So related to all of this is the concept of agency, which is exercising influence over life events. So it is self-direction, agency is action. Self-efficacy is belief in your efforts. In particular, within this course, we're talking about self-efficacy is belief in your efforts to learn. So agency is action, and it is self-directed. Self-efficacy is belief in your efforts. So we're going to spend just a little bit more time on self-efficacy. Can't get enough of it. So self-efficacy, again, is belief. People, so this is a quote from Bandura from 1994, people's beliefs about their capabilities to produce designated levels of performance that exercise influence over events that affect their lives. So that's Bandura's definition of self-efficacy. So other points to consider about that. Self-efficacy is future-orientated in that it tells us what we believe will be, or it is based on what we believe will be the results of our actions. For example, if a student says, I will crush the next algebra test, then he or she is just demonstrating self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is context specific, meaning it varies. What we believe about our efforts is tied to mastery experiences. So how we've done in the past, like physiological arousal, how it makes us feel, vicarious experiences, what we've observed about others, and social persuasion, the influence of other people. So this is same. This is the same 4 things that we saw demonstrated in the video. So I would really pay attention to those 4 things as being factors in self-efficacy. But here's an example of self-efficacy being context specific. I have a wonderful self-efficacy for teaching and for learning about others, but put me in a classroom where we're going to learn about calculus, and my self-efficacy falls through the floor. Really don't have any love of math whatsoever. Unfortunate, but true. Then lastly, self-efficacy is focused on you as an individual without the need to compare yourself to others. So we're going to spend just another moment dealing with self-efficacy, self-concept, and self-esteem, and what are the differences. So self-efficacy is belief that you can or cannot do it, right? So it's belief, I can do it. Self-concept is comparison to a comparison of yourself to someone else. So I'm not as good at it as Poppy would be an example of self-concept. So how do I see myself doing on this task in relation to other people? And then self-esteem is where we have actually internalized beliefs. So I am worthy or not worthy, i.e. good or bad, based on my ability to do a task. So self-esteem, self-concept, and self-efficacy are obviously all related to self, but they are different, and it's important to understand that these terms are not synonymous. So they may be small distinctions, but they are distinctions nonetheless, and we need to be aware of those. So let's talk about self-efficacy in the classroom. It is important to note that both the teacher and the student need to have self-efficacy for learning to occur. Teachers need to believe that they will be effective in their teaching, and students need to believe that they can learn. Self-efficacy in student performance is improved when short-term goals are adopted so students can see visible progress. So it's important to always give feedback, to always provide small markers within the course, and that learning self-efficacy and student performance is also improved when learning strategies are taught. So we help the student with attention and focus. So what can I do to help you learn? Should be a question that every teacher is thinking when they're talking with the student. And then lastly, self-efficacy and student performance is improved when we receive rewards based on achievement, not just engagement. So reinforce the gaining of the skill. So we do want to encourage students to be engaged, but we also want to encourage them to do well. So when we think back on some of the concepts that we have dealt with, such as teachers who have set high expectations, having higher achieving students. You can see where this is kind of built on this concept of self-efficacy. So another important aspect within this chapter, in addition to self-efficacy and motivation, is this idea of self-regulated learning, or SRL. Self-regulation is the process we use to activate and sustain our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions in order to reach our goals. So when applied to learning, it is called self-regulated learning, i.e., it is how we learn what we learn. So self-regulated learning are all the strategies that we employ. If you think back to our chapters on cognitive processes, that is what we are dealing with here. Everyone employs self-regulation to some degree, but some are more adept at using it for learning. And you can certainly think about this based on your own experiences. You may be more adept at learning some topics than others. You may have friends who are more higher achieving across the board, and they have simply learned how to be better at self-regulating at some point in their life. So that being said, we are now going to focus on the two models of self-regulated learning, and the first one is the Winnie and Perry model. So within the self-regulated learning model of Winnie and Perry, there are 4 parts. The first part is to analyze the task. So what am I going to be doing? What am I asked to do? Then set goals and devise plans. 3, enact tactics and strategies. And 4, regulate the learning. So how am I, and regulating simply means that figuring out whether or not what we're doing is actually working. So if we take a look at the diagram over on the right, we can see that the Winnie and Perry model is a little bit of a cycle, but it is more like concentric circles within each other. You can also think about it as a wave where there might be an undertow and then a layer above that. So we have different interactions of these 4 parts. So one part might lead to another part, and it's not necessary that we go through the whole thing. But it is important to recognize that there are 4 parts to it. So what I mean is you might get to setting goals and devising plans and then realize that there's a problem, and that might push us back to some other part of the model. Okay. In juxtaposition to the Zimmerman model, to the Winnie and Perry model, we have the Zimmerman model. So this is another model based on the same idea, self-regulated learning. With the Zimmerman model, there are 3 parts. There's forethought, performance, and reflection. With forethought, we have task analysis and motivational beliefs. In the performance part, we have self-control and self-observation. And then in reflection, we have self-judgment and self-reaction. So we can see that the terminology is fairly close within the 2 models, but there are some subtle differences in the conception. So what both models share is analysis. They share performance and enacting. They share reflection and self-regulation. They share a cyclical nature. And there is also some respect for self-efficacy for self-regulated learning. So there is some need within both models to think about whether or not the learner has self-efficacy to learn. So self-regulated learning, teaching students to learn how to learn. This is it's really more of a general idea that kind of encompasses both Winnie and Perry and Zimmerman. And we're just going to call it the self-regulation cycle. So each phase is impacted by student motivation and your use of learning strategies. So we have forethought, performance, and self-reflection. And what we want to be thinking about is what can we do to support students' ability to self-regulate. And this is very similar to some of the things that we were talking about within the cognitive processes chapters. So let's start by thinking about forethought. And this is, and what we want to do here is to engage students in thinking about what they know and what they need to know. So that KWL idea lends itself to this idea, right? The forethought. What do I know? So target goal setting, clear goals of moderate difficulty. So we don't want to set tasks that are too hard. We want to also think about perceptions of tasks, so their relevance and utility in terms of students, and then prior knowledge and the ease of learning judgment. So these are things to help students think about. The next part of the self-regulation cycle is performance. And we want to help students monitor their learning process to stay engaged in the task. So we can teach them anxiety coping skills. So I know there are at least a couple of students in here that have expressed test anxiety. And so I have tried to, in my small way, help them develop some coping strategies. It can be particularly difficult to deal with those kinds of issues. But certainly if a student has fear of math, we would want to encourage them to work through that fear. Also, metacognitive judgment of learning relative to goals. So we want to help them think metacognitively to make assessments of themselves. We want to monitor efforts. We want to provide opportunities for rehearsal, elaboration, or organizational strategies. Sometimes we need to provide them, that's providing some scaffolding. We want to help them think about the regulation of the study environment. So I know in my face-to-face class, I had a bone to pick about the main floor or the main library. I forget what they call it now, but it's the first floor, and there's a lot of activity on that floor, and it is really difficult to learn in that kind of environment. The regulation of the study environment, you need to be thinking about your distractions. And I know students say, oh, I can study with the television on, I can study with music on. Maybe you can, but maybe you do a lot better if you can. Studies have shown that really, we say we can multitask, but the brain can only attend to one thing at a time. And so when we are bouncing back and forth between a couple of things, what we're really doing is putting more task, more weight on our cognitive load. So we're just adding more to what our brain needs to process through and process out and make decisions about. And so it just makes sense to spend time thinking about the study environment that you're in and reducing all of those distractors to a minimum. We also want to encourage interest in monitoring and reward strategies as much as possible. So thinking about if you're in a classroom and you have students working on tasks and you want to do something that helps them encourage the use of thinking. All right, so last part of self-regulated learning or opportunities to think about learning is self-reflection. So when students can reflect on what they learn or can improve upon the next time, it helps restart the cycle. So we want to help them assess goal achievement. We want to help them think about time and study adjustment, to encourage help seeking when they need it, and then help them make success or failure attribution. So if you are ascribing your shortcomings to the instructor, and sometimes this is true, don't get me wrong, I've certainly been in classrooms where I felt like, somebody else could have done a better job. But really, truly, we are all captains of our learning. So it is on us to learn. So if something's not working, then we need to seek help. It is most of the time, your instructor is not really going to understand where your problems are coming from. And so even when we do seek help, we need to be able to articulate where our difficulties are coming from. So, and it's very important to consider when I get in a question that when I get a statement such as, I'm confused, I don't know where to begin. So I think it's very important for us as students when we are looking for help to kind of evaluate, to already be thinking and evaluating where we're at. So we want to help students provide accurate judgments of efficacy and effort. So what have I done to help myself learn? So just going to beat up on this point for a little bit longer, and then we're done. So the importance of student reflection, and this is a study. Students completed a task. So for example, a logical reasoning test, and students estimated how their score would compare with other students. So the strongest students underestimated their performance. The weakest students overestimated their performance. Just kind of interesting, right? Why would that be? The strongest students really felt they weren't maybe doing that well, but they were. And then the weakest students were thinking, oh, I'm doing great, but they really weren't at all. So what does that say about the student? Again, think about the course that we're in with as psych, right? We're thinking about why and how people think. So studies like this give us a correlation, but they don't actually explain why. And it's kind of on us as thinkers to develop some of that thought process. So again, lower scoring students overestimated their own skill level. They failed to recognize the degree of their insufficient knowledge, and they recognized their lack of skill only if they were trained to improve. So this is something that as instructors, we need to take some responsibility for. Okay, so other notes on the importance of student reflection, again, based on this same type of study, student prediction of their exam performance for physical geology. Most students were within 10 points of the actual score, so they had an idea of how they actually did. However, several low-scoring students were unable to predict their performance. Their explanations were poor preparation, poor study. So the reasons why this may have happened is they had poor preparation, poor study habits, poor assessment of understanding. The students that are most likely to struggle in class are the least prepared to recognize their lack of understanding. Important to know. They're not necessarily going to be able to tell you, I don't get it, or where they don't get it. And that can be very frustrating. But again, what's our responsibility? Our responsibility is to teach every student to the best of our ability. Right. So, retrieval practice. Research on learning shows that retrieval practice is the most effective study method. Students don't know this. Students don't understand that the more time they practice, the better they're going to do. So simple reflection exercises during or following a lecture will improve later recall of information. The more practice that students get at retrieval, the more they will recall later in that situation. So as students, I encourage you to employ this. Provide yourself with multiple opportunities to retrieve information. What do I remember? Ask yourself that. What do I remember about this? And you don't have to sit down with the textbook to do that. You can be standing in line at Hy-Vee and go through and think, wow, what were those 4 parts of self-efficacy? And try to remember them. The more we do this, the easier it's going to be when we get to exams. Okay. So pretty much the same point, but with long-term memory, remember to repeat. The more time that passes before attempting retrieval, the more we forget. So actually the highest rate of forgetting is within the first 24 to 48 hours. So spending some time after you watch one of my lectures or after you attend a lecture to go over the notes, that's going to be the most beneficial to you. Okay, so thinking or talking about an event immediately after it occurs enhances memory of the event. So again, taking notes, going over the notes right after is going to have the most benefit. Reviewing material at fixed or spaced intervals enhances memory. So after class reflection, online quizzes, recitations, tutorials, study group, etc. Doing it more than once, not just after class once, not just 2 weeks later, but maybe 1 week later, 2 weeks later. And what you'll find is the more times you do it, the quicker it goes. And really what we're talking about here is efficiency of learning. So I know we like to think, oh, I'm going to cram and I'm going to make it happen. And it's the worst possible way to actually go about learning. So distributing our learning over a longer period with more chances for repetition is actually going to give us the highest opportunities for success. And that's what we want in ourselves, and that's what we want from our students. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture for today, or for this unit rather. Again, I will see you on the discussion board. So thanks for your attention. Have a great morning, evening, or day. Thanks so much.